Okay, looks like we're live. Hi everybody, if you're joining us, hopefully you can hear us okay. Hope you've had a good day, and we're just going to wait a few seconds while everybody joins. But in the meantime, if you want to use the chat bar to tell us where you're joining us from, perhaps tell us how your day has been, anything of note. And I'd also ask, grab a pen, grab a pen and paper. I can hear myself. Tell us how your day has been, anything of note. And I'd also ask. There we go. I had two screens open. I could hear myself. That was confusing. Okay, so yeah, use the chat bar. Tell us where you're joining us from, and we'll make a start in just a second. And like I say, if you grab a pen and paper, that would be really helpful because we're going to do a few short tasks in a bit as well. So like I say, welcome if you just joined us. We're going to just wait a few seconds, and we'll get started in a minute. Hi, Rebecca. Someone's out there. How are you, Rebecca? Hope you're well. Brilliant. Okay, right. It looks like a few more have joined. Hi, Chris. Hi, V. Brilliant. Okay, we'll just wait 30 more seconds and then we'll get started. Hi to everybody that's just joined. Hope you've had a good day. We're going to get started in a second. Hi, Beth. Brilliant. Hi, Matt. Okay, brilliant. Right, I think we'll make a start. People might join us as we go along, but we'll see how we do. Oh, hi, Rebecca. It's been a long afternoon, but an even longer day tomorrow. Take over year 10 tomorrow, so that'll be interesting. Oh, you'll do great, Rebecca. You'll enjoy that. Hi, Sarah. Brilliant. Okay, well, like I say, we'll make a start. But people will hopefully join a bit more and as we go along. So this afternoon, we're going to spend some time thinking about how to make schools LGBT plus inclusive. So we're going to spend an hour or so. We've got a few short tasks to do, and hopefully we'll have some interactivity. So please use the chat bar at any time if you've got any questions or anything that you would like to contribute. So I'm sure most of you know me, but we've got some other skits joining us today. So my name's Adam. I've been a secondary teacher for 14 years. I run a secondary skit, Red Hill Skit. And I'm a researcher. I predominantly look at LGBT inclusion in education. And I'm co-founder of an organization called Pride and Progress, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on in the slides. So this afternoon, we're going to try and achieve three things. First of all, we're going to spend some time thinking about LGBT terminology and language. We're then going to think about the impact of the school environment on LGBT students and colleagues. And then finally, we're going to spend some time thinking about some scenarios that might happen in our classroom or things we might see in the school environment, and thinking about the ways in which we might deal with those or challenge those if, for example, the inappropriate language. So that's our aims for this afternoon. We'll see how we get on. Going to kick off with a bit of fun. Oh, actually, this isn't fun before I get to that slide. Caveat, I've said this before, but it's always be comfortable being uncomfortable. Whenever looking at diversity and inclusion, it's very natural to worry about getting something wrong or making a mistake. But of course, that is the entire reason we're all here. So this is a safe space in which you can ask questions, make mistakes, and lean into that feeling when you feel it, because normally that means you're going to develop your knowledge on something, which is a wonderful thing. So on to the fun bit. Going to give you 2 minutes. We love a flag in our community. 10 flags there, but I'm not that cruel. All of them are at the bottom. Going to ask you in the chat bar to write the numbers and which flags you think. Going to give you 2 minutes, and then I'll give you the answers. So 2 minutes, chat bar, pair the numbers up with the different ones. We'll see how we get in. 2 minutes, off you go. Okay, so if you've just joined us, a few have just joined, we're having a bit of a starter activity. We've got 10 flags in the LGBT community. I'm asking you to have a go at naming the ones, whether all 10 or perhaps in the chat bar, just the ones that you think you might know. See how many you get. It's going to give you a minute or so. Emily, very good. Yep, Izzy got it as well. V, spot on. Right, Chris, let's see. I think Chris might have nailed most of them there. I think between us, we've probably got all the answers. Okay, good. Sharon, not a clue, not a problem at all. Okay, just give you a few more seconds. Okay, right. So I'm going to give you the answers on the next slide. Like I say, this is of course just a bit of fun to get us started, but it also warms up some of that language for us that we're going to be using in just a second's time. So I'll put the answers on the screen. If you want to kind of share your result in the chat bar, you're very welcome to. It's not a competition. If you know none, that's absolutely fine. But like I say, it'd be interesting to see how many you might have got. There may be many of these you've never seen before, and some of them are quite recently invented actually, so there's possibly a reason for that. Okay, so hopefully you got a few of those. If not, absolutely no problem at all. But like I say, it kind of warms up the language, some of the terms we're going to use in this presentation this afternoon. So some of those terms you may have heard of before, and some you may not have heard of, and that's absolutely fine. So we're going to jump into our first aim then, which is trying to develop confidence in using LGBT plus terminology and language. Okay. So language is really important. Language constructs reality. And I think for us as teachers, that's crucially important because we've potentially got LGBT students and colleagues that are using a particular set of language and vocabulary. And if we don't have a knowledge or an understanding of using that vocabulary, it could be we're actually denying them their realities in some way. So it's important that we try our best to develop and understand the language that others use. But also language is important because we can't think outside of language. So if we have a new language and vocabulary, we can hopefully describe and imagine more inclusive alternatives for our students. So I'm going to put on the screen a number of LGBT terms. And this is where I'm going to ask you to grab your pen and paper, and I'm going to go radio silence for a few minutes. And I'd like you to really think about each of these terms. Again, it may be you've never heard some of these before, that's absolutely fine. But I'd like you to jot down what you think each one means. And then after that, we'll get some feedback, and I'll go through each one as well to give you some more confidence in using it. So we've got 10 terms here. So we've got LGBTQIA+, the slightly longer initialism of LGBT. Trans, transgender, gender identity, queer, cisgender, non-binary, gender dysphoria, transitioning, intersex, and then a big old word to finish there, which is heteronormativity. So I'm just going to give you 2 or 3 minutes. Like I say, pen and paper. You're very welcome to pop questions in the chat bar in the meantime, but just pop down what you think each of those mean, and then we'll spend a little bit of time going through those and seeing if we know. Okay, so 2 or 3 minutes, see how you get on. I'm just going to go mute for a few minutes. Any questions, pop them in the chat bar. Okay, hopefully you've had a bit of time to think there. What I'd ask each person to do, if you're happy to, is for one of those terms, perhaps the one you feel most confident about, could I ask you in the chat bar just to put a brief explanation of what you think that term means, and then I can build upon those as we go through. So give you a minute or so. If everybody could contribute what they think at least one of those terms means in the chat bar, that'd be really helpful, and it'll give us a starting point to think about some of this language. So when you're ready, pop in the chat bar one of the definitions for me. That'd be great. Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. Kicking us off with cisgender. Gender identity is the same as the sex you were assigned at birth. Perfect. So Holly has said gender dysphoria, feeling of when your outward appearance gender does not match the way you feel inside. Thank you, Holly. That's a really helpful definition. Heteronormativity, when man and woman relationship is accepted as the normal one. Brilliant. Thanks, Matthew. Beth unpacked the initialism for us. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, asexual plus. Thank you very much. Sarah, cis. Yep, brilliant. Same definition. That's great. Brilliant. Thank you, Emily. Transitioning, the process of changing from one gender to the other. Holly, transitioning from the gender assigned at birth. Adam, queer, the umbrella term reclaimed from the former slur as a means of a reclaimed identity. Oh, it's just moved up. Sorry, lost it there. For the whole LGBT people. Thank you, Adam. Sarah, non-binary, don't identify fully as male or female. These are great, everybody. Thank you so much for your contributions. Gender identity, how you identify in terms of gender, does not have to be the same as your sex. Brilliant. Rebecca, queer as an umbrella term, absolutely. Holly Williams, gender identity, what gender you view yourself as, great. Chris, is non-binary an umbrella term for having no gender fluid or gender that is not male or female? Perfect. Yep, we'll come back to that more in just a second. Keep them coming. Some great definitions here. Thank you all so much for your contributions. Heteronormativity, believing everyone should be heterosexual. Yep, that's a good definition for that one. Excellent. Any more, pop them in the chat bar. Thank you so much to everybody that's contributed something there. That's really helpful. I'll just spend a minute talking through these, but actually in the chat bar, we've got some near perfect definitions for most of them. So it's probably a good caveat for me to start before we start talking about language to acknowledge that language changes over time and people use language differently to describe themselves. So I'm going to give some broad strokes definitions here. But it's important to acknowledge, like I say, things can change. And if someone describes themselves in a particular way, then of course we're going to respect that. Izzy, intersex when someone is born with both male and female parts. Brilliant. Thanks, Izzy. I'll add some more to that in just a second. So I'll just go through these fairly quickly. If you'd like me to add any more detail, if you've got any follow-up questions, pop them in the chat bar as I'm going. I'm more than happy to come back. So like I say, we've got the extended initialism, LGBTQIA+. So lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, sometimes questioning, intersex, and then the A, we've not got asexual on this grid here. So asexual or aromantic describes somebody that doesn't experience sexual or romantic attraction. And the plus acknowledges, like I say, language regularly changes and people might describe their identities in a variety and myriad of ways, which is a wonderful thing, but the acronym, the initialism, gets increasingly long. So we just sort of put the plus there to acknowledge that. So I think a helpful way to think about the LGBTQIA initialism is an umbrella term that describes identities that are not heterosexual and are not cisgender. That word we'll come back to in just a second. So trans, short for transgender, somebody that's living in a gender different to the sex assigned at birth. And it's important to say to be trans and to be protected under the Equality Act, you don't have had to have received medical intervention, but you've taken steps to live in your chosen gender. And that could just be pronouns or name or clothes, whatever it might be. But there's sometimes a misnomer, there has to be a medical intervention, but that's not the case. Gender identity, as Holly said, how you identify in terms of gender does not have to be the same as your sex. Someone wants to describe gender identity as what's between your ears and not what's between your legs, which I quite like. It's your internal sense of gender. Queer, I think Adam nicely described the umbrella term reclaimed from the former slur as a means of reclaimed identity for the whole LGBT people. So it's sometimes used as an umbrella term in the way LGBT plus is, and sometimes it's used as a sort of rejection of labels. So it's used in a variety of ways, but that's a good definition from what Adam's given us. Cisgender, somebody that identifies with a sex assigned at birth, their gender is the same. So I'm a cisgender male, for example. Whereas non-binary might be somebody that has perhaps entirely rejects the categories of male and female, or it might be they feel they're on some sort of spectrum where some days they feel more male or more female, or exhibit characteristics in both of those. So people use that term in slightly different ways, but as a consequence, they often use gender-neutral pronouns such as they, them, and if they were a teacher, they might use a title such as MX rather than Mr. or Mrs. MX, which is pronounced MUX or mix. Gender dysphoria is that feeling that if your gender, doesn't assign with the sex assigned at birth, doesn't marry up with it, you might experience distress or anxiety about that. So gender dysphoria is the name for that feeling, and young people often feel that when they're going through puberty, as their body starts to develop in a way that's not congruent with how they identify or think about their sense of gender. Transitioning is the steps they're taking to live in their other identity, like we talked about just then, perhaps pronouns and clothes and so on. Intersex, I think Izzy was pretty spot on. So intersex is when a person has characteristics, male and female characteristics, which could be primary or secondary sexual organs, chromosomes, or what's the other one? Hormones. So a combination of both male and female. And that's really important for us to think about because it challenges that very rigid binary of male and female. And it's actually quite a few people that are born intersex. It's estimated it's 1.7% of the population, which is roughly the same number of people that have red hair. So that's quite significant, and it allows us to trouble that very rigid binary we have in our culture. And finally, that big old word is heteronormativity, believing everyone should be heterosexual, or perhaps the assumption that everybody is heterosexual without them telling you otherwise. And also that heterosexuality is sort of valued as the sort of premier, the top sexuality, and others are less than in some way. So that's quite a whistle-stop tour of that language. If you'd like me to develop any of those definitions, please let me know. Similarly, if there's language that I've not included on the screen there, but you've heard or would like me to define or give some more detail to, please pop those in the chat bar and I'll be more than happy to address those. So I'll carry on, but please pop those in the chat bar because I'm conscious of the delay. I can come back to those if there are any questions, but hopefully that's been a helpful starting point. Okay, so we spent a little bit of time there thinking about terminology. We're now going to think about the school environment. What impact the school environment has on LGBT students and colleagues. Now, schools are stubbornly heteronormative environments, and that's something we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about today and the impact that has on LGBT people. So we're going to kick off with some context. So it's estimated there are 50,000 LGBT teachers in the profession. Now, we're going to have a better understanding of that later in the year when the census data is revealed. LGBT and professions, that data will come later in the year, but for now that is the estimate. And a lot of my research looks at the challenges LGBT teachers have in school environments because they often feel hyper-visible or invisible, and they often struggle to manage their personal professional boundaries, identities. So those are some of the things I'm interested in, but there's some of the things that teachers often find challenging being in the space of a school. This is a snippet of data from the most recent Stonewall school report. 2017 was the last one. I'll just be quiet for a minute while you have a quick read of that. And I think this data is important for us to think about because I think often people think in 2023, LGBT inclusion has come a long way, it's all perfect, there's no problems anymore. But actually, as you can see from some of these statistics, it's still very challenging to be an LGBT person, especially a young person in a school. And that final bullet point, obviously quite a harrowing statistic, that more than 2 in 5 trans young people have attempted to take their own life, and then 1 in 5 for LGBT. So I think that really does highlight that, yes, schools have had phenomenal improvements over the last 20 years. There still remains a lot of work to be done, and we need to acknowledge that LGBT, particularly trans and non-binary young people and colleagues, have a very challenging time in schools, and we need to think about the things we can do to hopefully make their experience less stressful. Some other interesting data. Stonewall did a Rainbow Britain survey last year, and these were the results. They asked people how many people identified exclusively as heterosexual. So baby boomers, easy for me to say, people who are 56 to 75, 91% of them identified as heterosexual, whereas Generation Z, the most recent generation, 16 to 26, only 71% identified as heterosexual. So some really interesting data there, and we can analyze and think about what the reasons why that may be, but hopefully it's because we have better language and vocabulary to describe these things now, and a culture where people are starting to feel more comfortable in sharing their truth. So that's a really interesting bit of data, I think. And similarly, the census data was released just this week, hot off the press, in terms of the age groups for LGBT and trans people. And again, you can see that similar trend in terms of the younger age groups, greater numbers of people identifying their sexuality and gender in different ways to heterosexual or cisgender. So I think it's quite interesting, but crucially, we need to think about the tide of that, because we've got students coming into our school who are describing their sexualities and genders in new and brilliant ways. So we as educators need to make sure that hopefully we have that language, and we don't want to be in a place where the students know more about things than we do. So I think it's helpful for us to think about, but also it highlights the imperative of making sure that we as schools are kind of savvy with this language as well. And then a recent update from this September in terms of the Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance. They've specifically added the following sections that says the fact that a child or a young person may be LGBT in itself is not inherent a risk factor for harm. However, children who are LGBT can be targeted by other children. In some cases, a child who's perceived to be LGBT, whether it's the case or not, can be just as vulnerable. So it's identifying that LGBT young people in schools still experience challenges. And then it further says risks can be compounded where children who are LGBT lack a trusted adult with whom they can be open. And then highlighted here, it's therefore vital that staff endeavour to reduce the additional barriers faced and provide a safe space for them to speak out or share their concerns with members of staff. So not only is our moral duty, it's our statutory duty to make sure that our LGBT young people in our schools are safe and are being looked after. Okay, so there's quite a lot there in terms of data and kind of some up-to-date guidance. If there's any questions so far, please put them in the chat bar, or any point during the presentation, you're more than welcome to, and I'll answer those. In the meantime, I will carry on, but please jump in with questions at any point you'd like to ask anything. Okay, so let's revisit that big old word then of heteronormativity in schools and think about the impact that can have on the people that occupy them. So quick definition there, along with the reference from my era of music. Let you read it. Okay, so like we said earlier, that kind of assumption that everybody is heterosexual and it kind of being valued as the normative sexuality. So schools are very much heteronormative, and I think it's really interesting to think about the ways in which they are constructed as heteronormative rather. So heteronormativity is a socially constructed idea. It's held in the collective minds of people, and therefore it's something that's continuously under construction and being built, a bit like the Matrix, which is why I like it as an analogy. But similarly, once we've been unplugged, we can see the code that's creating it, and I think it's then really helpful for us to identify the things that are holding heteronormativity in place, and then hopefully we can challenge and have an alternative. So Sarah said, sometimes we say LGBT and sometimes LGBTQI, which do we use? Sarah, that's absolutely fine. So the reason I use LGBT is just frankly, it's easy to say, because if I say LGBTQIA plus many times in a row, that's something of a tongue twister. So I generally say LGBT plus because that plus captures everything else. But for me, it's just an easier thing to say. Other people will use the longer initialism. So there's no right or wrong answer to that question. It's whatever you're happy using. But I think as long as you understand that it means a variety of identities, that's really helpful. Matthew, I was listening to Skater Boy the other day and was struck by these lyrics. First of all, well done for having such great music taste. But also, yes, it's very that feels quite outdated, those lyrics at this point, doesn't it? So yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, okay, thanks, Sarah. Some of the things that construct this heteronormativity. And we're going to talk about microaggressions. You've probably heard of them before, microaggression theory. And we're going to look at the different forms of microaggressions that people experience, particularly LGBT people, and the ways in which this holds this normativity in place. So you've probably heard of microaggressions before, but if not, here is a brief definition for you to read. So microaggressions, they're everyday, they're often small, often kind of insidious. Sometimes they're well-intended, there's a variety, but crucially, they have this dripping tap effect where they drip, 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 remind you that you're not the norm or what's expected, and some way marginalize you or other you. So microaggressions are categorized with 3 subcategories, and I think they're helpful for us to name, because then we can call them out when we see them in schools, but also we can then hopefully challenge why they're thinking that way and replace it with hopefully a more inclusive alternative. So the first category or form of microaggression. Now you might question the word micro, which I certainly do. I didn't come up with the language of microaggressions. There's nothing micro about some of these, but nonetheless. The first one is called micro assaults. So these refer to explicit or purposeful comments or actions meant to demean or upset the recipient. And this can include homophobic language and abuse, avoidance and isolating, or physical contact. So in school, hopefully these things are easier to identify than the next categories we're going to talk about. There should, of course, be policies in place for these, and they will be escalated if these things happen. But nonetheless, they're things that sadly do happen, but they're, despite being called micro, I think macro is probably a better word, micro assaults refer to those explicit or purposeful things that people are doing. It's the next 2 categories that are slightly more insidious and sometimes a bit harder to see and challenge, but it is helpful for us to have that kind of critical awareness so we can identify them when they do happen. So the next category is called micro insults, and these refer to unconscious, often well-intended, and I'll come back to that in a second, verbal or non-verbal communication that can demean a person's identity. So for example, the automatic assumption that boys like girls and vice versa. Do you have a girlfriend? Now that's one that doesn't sound like a big deal, but I can tell you from lived experience, it gets draining pretty quickly. Often, like in a taxi or something, the taxi driver will just ask if you've got a girlfriend, if you're married or something, which on its own isn't a big deal. And obviously that taxi driver isn't trying to be offensive. And that comment on its own, it doesn't mean very much. But as someone that receives those microaggressions all the time, it's constantly reminding you that you're not the norm, that's not what's expected. And then you either have to decide whether to tell the truth and make them feel uncomfortable more often than not, or just kind of shut it down or lie about it. So it's a small thing, but the person that you're asking the question to tends to internalize the shame or the stress that comes with that. And it can be quite draining as an emotional tax over time. It could be an explicit male and female changing room, for example, or toilets, which make a trans or gender questioning person feel unsure or uncomfortable which to use. And therefore, implicitly, they're being communicated by the environment that they don't belong. Andrew said, Ari, the definitions at the start, is there a website you'd recommend that lists them for reference? The LGBT ones, Andrew. Yeah, there's many. The Stonewall's probably your best bet, and they have a great bank of resources, and we'll probably go into some of those in slightly more detail as well. So Stonewall will be a great starting point, but I'll also give you some signposting to others at the end of the presentation. Okay. And then our final category of microaggressions are called micro-invalidations. So comments or actions that dismiss the realities or experiences of being an LGBT person. So it might be assuming it's easy to be LGBT these days due to the improved legislation and attitudes. And again, it's something to be celebrated. Gay marriage, that's clearly all we ever wanted, but it's still challenging. And, if I'm going on holiday, I still have to go onto the internet and see if I'm allowed to legally exist in that country, for example. So yes, challenges remain. It could also be telling a person who's come out to you that it's not a big deal. To them, it probably was a big deal, caused serious anxiety and worry. So I think it's helpful for us, while we don't want to make a big deal out of it, not to belittle it. Oh, we always knew, it's obvious, it's no big deal. That can probably invalidate what's probably been quite a stressful and difficult point getting to there. So those are some examples of what we would call microaggressions, things that kind of hold that normativity in place. So hopefully with that language, it's helpful for us to identify what those things look like, and maybe then have a further conversation with that person about what they're conveying by what it is they're saying. I'll give you some strategies in a minute how you might approach some of those. So as always, if there's any comments or questions about anything I've said so far there, please pop those in the chat bar. I'll carry on, but anything that's helpful to contribute or questions to ask, please feel free to do so. Okay, so we've spent some time thinking about terminology. We've had a bit of a think about the impact the school environment can have on LGBT people. We're now going to spend some time looking at some scenarios and some guidance. So these things are likely to happen in your career, and I'm going to hopefully give you some scaffolding, some structure in how it might be best to deal with them. So I'm going to do 2 short case study activities here. Our first one is addressing inappropriate language. So we've got Charlie here. Charlie's 14, an average student and generally popular with other students. He is large for his age, a good athlete, and the leader of a group of boys who pride themselves on their own masculinity, occasionally intimidating other students with their macho behavior. So I'm going to ask you then, please. Let's imagine you're walking across the field or the playground or whatever, excuse me, and you hear Charlie call another student a faggot. So it could be break time, for example. My question to you is, how might you deal with this? Now, don't worry if you've got no idea and your mind would go blank. That's the reason we're doing this activity. But can I ask everyone to contribute something in the chat bar for me, please? How could you deal potentially with this situation? So I'll give you a minute to think about it. Pop something in the chat bar, and we'll share a few thoughts. So how would you deal with this situation? Henry, that's a great question. I'm going to come back to that at the end, if that's all right. I'll make a note of it now. Okay, thanks, Adam. Previous placement was an immediate exclusion, but this would also provide an opportunity to educate them through others' lived experience. Great. So there's two important parts to that, isn't there, Adam? The first one is, of course, some sanction to acknowledge that it's not appropriate. But crucially, there has to be an education piece around it. Otherwise, you're not addressing the root of the issue that's causing that. So thanks, Adam. That's two really important things to come from that example. Stop him and tell him that is unacceptable language and won't be tolerated. Yeah, absolutely, Sarah. So interject at that time and make sure it's explicitly addressed as inappropriate language. That's helpful. Thank you. Izzy, ask if recipient is okay. Brilliant. Pull Charlie aside and have a conversation about why that language isn't okay in school, out of school or at home, and then appropriately sanction. Thank you, Izzy. Charlie needs to be told off for using the slur and sanctioned. Yep, that's lovely. Thanks, Matt. Sharon, ask the child if he knows what the word means. Talk about the meaning in name calling. Yeah, that's really important, isn't it, Sharon? Because actually often people use these words without understanding the meaning. Like when I was young, gay was a synonym for rubbish. And I think genuinely people didn't know what it meant. It was just so assumed it was just a bad thing. So I think making them unpick the understanding of the language is really important. V, I would ask Charlie what the definition of faggot is. Yep. Does he know what it means and the history behind it, or was it just a word he just heard? Yeah, really important. V, does he know the seriousness of the history of that language? That's helpful. Chris, I'd isolate Charlie from the group there and then issue a detention, raise it with someone in SLT. Yeah, I think that's a really crucial part of what Chris has said, because often if you try and address these things in front of another group, that student's trying to save face or be cool in front of their friends, and you will never get a helpful conversation from that. So separating them from the group before that conversation is a really helpful thing to do. Andrew, ask Charlie how he would feel on the receiving end of such behavior. Yeah, absolutely, because then we're developing empathy, which is kind of the key to get people to understand the significance of these things. So thank you, that's really helpful. Marcella, this is bullying, so it will be challenged and sanctioned and inform the tutor and head of house. Brilliant. Yep. So we're escalating it appropriately. We don't have to deal with everything on our own, but we need to report it to the appropriate people, and the pastoral teams can make sure they deal with it further as well as needed. So that's really helpful. Thanks, Marcella. Any other contributions in the chat bar? Okay, well, thank you all so much for sharing the things you would do in that situation. I think all of those are great, and actually there's some things there we could compile to what we might be kind of a model response to that. So I'm going to give you kind of an acronym that I think is really helpful in dealing with these types of situations, but obviously we've got a great set of examples there in the chat bar as well. So the acronym I'm going to share with you it's called IDEA. This is from my friend Shona Reed, who some of you know. She did a session at the conference, and she runs a consultancy business, and she uses the acronym of IDEA. I think I've just got a couple more things in the chat bar. Just bear with me 1 second. Emily, approach him and sanction him one-to-one immediately, explaining why it's inappropriate and ask him if he knows what it means. Great. And to explain why it's a hurtful slur, that's helpful. Holly, would we have a similar approach to someone calling someone gay, like, oh, this lesson is gay? Yeah, I 100% Holly, because again, they might not realize that word. They might just think it means the same as rubbish, but educating them why that's an inappropriate word and why that would be considered homophobia, and the education piece around that is important. If a kid says gay, we don't have to come down with a ton of bricks, depending on how they're using it, but we do need to make sure they understand the significance of that word and why it's not appropriate. So thank you for that question. So IDEA then, this acronym, 4 stages: to interrupt, to describe, to explain, and then ultimately an apology or an action, or potentially both. So I'm just going to talk through the scenario we've just done here and explain how we could use that idea acronym to structure our response. And this is really helpful because here, when we're all sat at our computers calmly, we can perfectly describe how we deal with the situation. But in the heat of the moment, when things are, difficult and perhaps the student's not responding how we'd like, this is really helpful for us to think about how we can approach that situation in an effective way. So let me talk through each of these letters and give an example of how we might challenge Charlie's behavior. So first of all, we need to stop that behavior happening, especially if it's kind of a tirade of abuse. So we're going to interrupt. And we could say something to the effect of, "Can I stop you there, please?" Or, "Excuse me, can you come here? I need you to listen." Whatever it is, but we're disrupting and interrupting what is currently taking place. And then it might be we have that conversation there, or as we've described, somewhere in a more appropriate place where others aren't listening. So you might walk to one side, for example, but we're interrupting to stop that initial behavior. We're then going to describe what has happened so we can address that particular thing. I think I just heard you use the word faggot, or you just used homophobic language, something to that effect. But we're describing what has taken place, so therefore we can address the issue, which part of that is the particular issue. We're then going to explain. So it could be something to this effect: "That's an incredibly offensive term. Do you understand why? Homophobic language is not tolerated in this school. That's a form of direct discrimination. Do you understand that?" But we're trying to get them to understand the significance of why. And there might be a bigger piece required for that. And that's when the pastoral teams can set in, or if it's a cultural thing that school kind of is, if homophobia is very casually used in the school, there's probably a bigger piece of work to be done by the leadership teams. So we can pass that information on, but we need to explain why that is an issue. And then finally, an apology or some action. So I'll be recording this as a homophobic incident and reporting it. And then only getting them to apologize if and when, because there's nothing worse than forcing a student to apologize to somebody else when they don't mean it, or it can actually make the situation worse. So if they've empathetically understood why their language is inappropriate and they want to apologize, great. That's a really powerful, useful thing. But if we're forcing them to do it without that piece, then it will have the opposite effect. So apology can be helpful, but if not, we certainly need the action piece for that. So hopefully that's a helpful acronym for you to use in situations. And again, it could be a way of challenging microaggressions if you're to hear those. So to interrupt, to describe, to explain, and then an apology or an action afterwards. So we're going to do a second case study example now. This time we're going to think about what might happen if a student comes out to you. Now, I hate the phrase coming out, but nonetheless, it's kind of the common the language. So if someone shares their sexual or gender identity with you and comes out to you. Now, this often happens if you're a trainee teacher or a new teacher to a school, because students often, if you're a new person, they feel more comfortable sometimes. Whether that's because you're a bit younger, perhaps, you might not be. It might be that you're a fresh face, if you're a pastoral lead, like a tutor or something. So the chances of this happening in your career are quite high, and that's usually a compliment because it means that young person trusts you. But then we want to make sure that we're responding in the appropriate way to be helpful for that young person as well. So let's do our second case study here. We've got Caden. So Caden is 16 years old. Even as a young child, Caden always felt more like a girl than a boy, and it's getting exhausting to keep trying to hide it at school. Caden comes to speak to you after a lesson and comes out to you, explaining they may be transgender and wants to be able to live in their chosen gender. So again, I'm going to pose this question to you, and I'll be grateful for any responses in the chat bar. If a child did come to you then, or explains their question, their gender identity, how could you deal with this? So the students just said to you, "I think I'm transgender." They may not have used that language. They might not have that sophistication of language. They're explaining to you they don't feel like their gender assigned at birth. How could we deal with that situation? So let's give you a minute and let's put some thoughts in the chat bar. Okay, Adam, signpost them to an LGBT club in school so that they can engage with people who are going through a similar experience to make them feel less isolated. Brilliant. So Adam's suggesting a safe space or a safe place or a safe person they can talk to. So you don't have to be the expert, but you can pass that on. So that's really helpful. Thank you. Is he thank them for coming out to me and trusting them? Yeah, really, really important. If we think back to the idea of micro-invalidations, if you're the first person they've told something to, and then your reaction is kind of gobsmacked or stunned, that's not going to be very helpful. So thanking them for coming out to you and for trusting you and creating that kind of initial reaction. Andrew, listen to them and try not to put words in their mouth. Yeah, that's a really good point, because obviously we've discussed some quite sophisticated language today, which they might not have, and that's absolutely fine. We don't have to give them that language, but we're going to listen to them and use the words that they use. Beth, start by thanking them for trusting you with that information and assure them that you will continue to be a safe person to talk to throughout this process. That's really lovely, Beth. Okay, maintain that trust. You may have to bring other people in, and it's we might think about that in some of the safeguarding procedures. Not that this is a safeguarding issue, I'll come back to that in a second, but thank them for trusting you and how you're going to continue to be a safe person to talk to. Sharon, let them talk, don't question them. Absolutely. You might be the first person they've told, and they just get a stream of consciousness comes out, so that's really helpful. Emily, thank them for feeling open enough to come to you and reassure them that it's not an open space, that it is an open space where there is no judgment. If comfortable enough, approach the conversation. If not, signpost to safeguarding. Yep, if you're not sure how to do that conversation, that's fine. You can still thank them and say, I'd like to speak to some other people to get some more support for you, and take it from there. Sarah, offer them someone to chat to. So see there as a group with peers that may have experienced similar things. Yep, brilliant. Okay, and there's some examples there. Marcella, would it be handled similar to safeguarding disclosure? I'm going to answer that in a second, Marcella, but that's a really important question, so thank you for asking that. Matthew, tell Caden you're happy they confided in you and that you have their best interests at heart. Answer all questions you can and show them how they can research when you're not around. Great, so they've got extra support networks too. Brilliant, thank you for that. There's some really wonderful suggestions there. Any others? Pop those in the chat bar. Ask few questions to understand their boundaries. Who knows, who doesn't, how they wish to proceed in school. Yeah, that's really helpful, Holly, because it allows us to know who and what we can and can't share. And offer them a no judgment safe space for them. Brilliant, a place they know they can come and speak their mind and speak honestly. That's really helpful too. Thank you for that. Any other comments? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing those. Marcella, I'm going to come back to your really important question, which was, would it be handled similar to a safeguarding disclosure? So this is a tricky one. Now, what I would suggest to you is if someone does come out to you, don't promise the confidentiality in the same way we would deal with a safeguarding issue, but someone coming out to you is not a safeguarding issue. It's not a safeguarding issue. Now, as we said in the Keeping Children Safe in Education report, it can mean they're more vulnerable and it could potentially be a safeguarding issue, but in and of itself, it is not a safeguarding issue. Sometimes telling the wrong people can cause a safeguarding issue. So if they say to you, please don't tell my parents, they're not on board with this, or it's a religious family or whatever, and we ring home and tell them, that's likely to cause a safeguarding issue. So while it's not a safeguarding issue, Marcella, we would still take some of the same processes in terms of not asking leading questions, thanking them for sharing it with you, and saying, I would like to share this with someone just so you're supported and have backup too. And it might be in this year, your mentor, in future years, a head of department, pastoral lead, or so on. So yes, the process is similar, but it's important not to conflate this with a safeguarding issue. So thank you, Marcella. That's a really important question. And Sarah, reassure them that they are not different or abnormal. Yeah, so important, especially if they're coming out as trans, because at the minute, if you're trans around the world, but in the UK, you can't turn on the television without having your identity debated or kind of the vitriol around it is awful. So we need to make sure they realise that it's a wonderful thing, not a terrible thing, and they're not going to have this awful life that's currently being portrayed in the media. So it's important that that initial reaction is sort of comforting and not invalidating to think about the microaggressions again. Brilliant. Thank you again so much for those really wonderful contributions. Again, any more, please put them in the chat bar. I'm just going to share a few of those points, but I think we've made most of them. So things that are helpful, thanking them for sharing the information with you, being positive and encouraging. It was probably a huge step. You're possibly the first person they've told. As a consequence, it's helpful to ask if they have shared this with their family and friends. And often they want to share it, but don't know how to. And then you or a member of the pastoral team might be the person to do that. And I've done that before as a head of year, but it doesn't have to be you. But we can facilitate that conversation if they're not comfortable having it themselves. Signpost them to other safe people or organizations and resources. I'm going to give you some of those in a moment. And then, like I said, speak with an appropriate member of staff. This disclosure, and I hate that phrase as well, but it is, that's how it's called in schools. It's not a safeguarding issue in itself. It could become one. They could be more vulnerable, but we need to be careful not to create more issues in the way with which we handle it. Okay, so hopefully those suggestions are helpful. Again, anything else in the chat bar, please add them on as we go. But otherwise, I will continue just keeping one eye on the times about 4:30. So I'm going to just do a few last slides in terms of top tips and things that I think are helpful, and then we've got some time for Q&A if there's anything anyone would like to ask. So things we can do. We can make sure there is things in our lessons. There's LGBT books and content and role models on the wall. You can't be what you can't see. And LGBT inclusion can be invisible. So we need to have things that are visible so people can see role models themselves. And as a consequence of that, getting the rainbows out is really important. Anyone that knows me, I'm always wearing a rainbow or a trans or some sort of pride color around my neck because I know the significance of it. I know the signal that gives to another LGBT person that I'm a safe person to talk to, they're in a safe space. To most people, it means nothing. But for someone that understands what these colors represent, it's really significant. And it just reminds them you're a safe person to talk to. So if you're comfortable wearing one of those, whether it's a tiny pin badge or a lanyard, something like that, it's a wonderful thing to include, or a flag in your classroom, a badge, whatever it might be. So I'm going to come back to Henry's question earlier about getting the pronouns wrong. So my encouragement is don't worry about getting it wrong. Terminology and perceptions regularly change. And obviously with things like gender neutral pronouns, a relatively recent thing for most people. And it takes a little while to get used to, particularly if you're used to using they, them as a collective noun. So if Henry's question was how to deal with it, the way to deal with it is to apologize quickly and move on. And the reason it's a quick apology and not the song and dance is I've seen it before and people feel so awful for getting it wrong. They do this elaborate apology. And then the person who's been misgendered then has to comfort you and reassure you, which completely flips the situation in an unhelpful way. So we apologize, we move on, and we try and do better next time. So that's I know it feels awful if you misgender somebody, but better to do that than make a big song and dance about it. Language is really hard in schools. For teaching for 15 years, most of those years I was saying ladies and gents in the classroom or guys and things like that. Possibly not very inclusive if you've got somebody in the classroom who's non-binary or questioning their gender. So we could use some gender neutral language, folks, year 10, teen, everybody. I really like teachers that call the students the discipline of the lesson they're in. So scientists, mathematicians, linguists, business, I've tried entrepreneurs, not quite sure which word to use yet, but that's nice. You're not being reduced to your gender in that room. You are the scholarly discipline that you're learning about, which I think is great. Sharing pronouns, if you're comfortable doing so, in signatures or bios or whatever is really helpful. It stops people assuming, it lets people check beforehand, and it might make someone else comfortable sharing theirs with you, which is a wonderful thing. Sharing others' stories to develop empathy is really important, and we can do that through examples in our curriculum, through things like TED Talks or current news stories. So there's a range of things we can do to develop empathy in people. We can challenge inappropriate language and microaggressions in the ways that we've talked about, and we've got the IDEA acronym to help us with that. And the last couple there is to be positive. Like I say, LGBT issues are often talked about in very serious tones or being debated, or it's very, very heated at the moment. And if that's your only kind of blueprint of what it's like to be LGBT or trans specifically from the earlier examples, that's going to make your life feel quite miserable. Where's the future for you? So we need to make sure we're presenting positive alternatives, positive narratives, and ways for them to see themselves in the future. The question, if Caitlin's parents call the school, I'm assuming there's a second part to that question, V, so I'll wait for it. You don't need to be the expert is my final tip there. It's great we've had the session today, and hopefully it's given you a starting point, but you're not going to be an expert after one session. So there's plenty of resources you can refer to, and plenty of organizations and people that can help you as well. Okay, V, back to your question. If Caden's parents call the school and demand the teachers don't recognize him, yeah, this is a really difficult one. And sadly, it does happen sometimes where the student has asked to be chosen, called by a different name as transgender, but the parents have strictly said you're not to. Now, my number one piece, the advice is this. You need to follow your school's procedure. Now, schools should have a transgender and non-binary policy. If they haven't, it's something I would raise with your mentor to pass up the school about how to deal with this. Now, I don't necessarily agree with all of schools' policies on this. Stonewall's interpretation of the Equality Act says that we should use the student's chosen name at all times, but some schools say that actually the parents' rights are the ones we should be respecting. Most schools will do a hybrid of these two things, where at school we call the child their chosen name, but it might be on a parents' evening or a phone call home we use their birth name or dead name, because that's sometimes called. So it's important that we are crystal clear on the school's policy. We may or may not agree with it. Some of them I don't agree with, but you obviously need to make sure that you're doing what the school expects of you. So what do we do in that instance, V? You will be advised by your school in how to approach it. Obviously, it's very challenging to not call the student the name they're chosen to be, but we need to think about sort of complying with what's expected by the school. So I hope that answers your question. Matthew, sometimes I found myself saying boys on the back row, and I'm a bit disappointed myself. I don't know what alternatives rolls best off the tongue. Yeah, I totally agree, Matthew. It's really hard, and I catch myself doing it sometimes. And I think it's sometimes thinking, whether you're identifying youth for on the back, using names where appropriate. But you're right. There's something about boys in the back row, or boys, because it's a synonym for immature, misbehaving. There's something about that, isn't there? So you might play around with it. You might have your scientists on the back row, for example. You might have whichever group it is. You might use some names. Play around with it. These things very quickly become comfortable once you use them 2 or 3 times. But you're right. We all fall into that type of language sometimes. But thank you for that, Matthew. And V, thank you for that really important question. Okay, great. So just the last few slides then. So some organisations to support. There's some great charities out there. Stonewall I've referenced a few times, the biggest LGBT charity in the UK. Educate and Celebrate are another great one, and I'll give you some of their resources in a second. Just Like Us are great. Mermaids is kind of the #1 trans charity for young people, and they have some wonderful, really detailed, comprehensive guidance, which cover pretty much any question you might have to ask. And if you're a primary colleague, Now Outsiders do some wonderful resources for primary schools, looking at all the protected characteristics and thinking about inclusion more holistically. So here are some of the resources from Educate and Celebrate. They have a range of lessons. You can, who doesn't love a pre-planned lesson? They have LGBT inclusion woven within them, and you can use those in your classroom, which is a really wonderful thing to do. Stonewall have got 2 programs, creating an LGBT inclusive secondary curriculum and one for primary as well. And within those, there's a range of lesson ideas, activities, starters, tasks, and so on. So that's a free document. I'd encourage you to print it, have it nearby somewhere. It just gives some little ideas of the things you can do in your lessons. And because every lesson shouldn't be an LGBT lesson, we can very subtly include things by changing the wording of a question. So it's 2 dads rather than a mum and dad in a maths question, for example. It's what Sue Sanders calls usualizing. It's the small little changes, so it seems everyday and frankly boring, which is kind of the end goal of it, really. So those are really good resources that you can use in both primary and secondary curriculums. And then what day is today? Wednesday kicks off LGBT History Month, which is a really important calendar date every year in schools. This year's theme is Behind the Lens, looking at people that work in film and industry that are LGBT. They have a great range of resources on their website, and I've also created my own Dropbox, which I can share afterwards, which has got some resources you can use in your lessons as well. So hopefully those things are helpful, but also it's a great opportunity to think about over your lesson planning over the next few weeks, how you could incorporate some LGBT visibility, some role models, some discussion, and hopefully create those role models for people. So I'm just going to ask to pause for a moment, and allyship is a really important thing because LGBT are the minority. We've looked at various statistics today, but regardless are the minority, and therefore we need people to be allies and to advocate for us and to look out for us. So I'm just going to ask you to think for a minute, where on that continuum would you place yourself at the start of this session? And there's no value judgment on that. It may be apathetic. That's absolutely fine. You never thought about it before. Where are you now? And what do you maybe need to do next to get to the next stage in that allyship continuum? Just give you a moment to think about that. And hopefully some of the resources I've shared so far will allow you to help with that. And I've got a couple more things here. So I mentioned Pride and Progress at the start. It began as a podcast. So it's a podcast that speaks with LGBT educators and allies. We've got a range of teachers, educators, senior leaders, heads of charities. We spoke to some actors and some Peter Tatchell was one of our more recent ones, a real range of voices about their experiences of LGBT inclusion in education. But in terms of developing the empathy and sharing stories, it's a wonderful way to hear about somebody else's experience in school. So if you don't know anything about being a non-binary person, you might go and listen to one of our episodes of The Non-Binary Teacher and hear about some of the challenges and opportunities that comes from being in a school without identity. And we've also, this is hot off the press actually, because the pre-orders just come through today. I'm going to stick it in the chat bar in a second. We've written a book which talks about all the advice that can, sorry, I'm just typing and talking, is a summary of all the things to talk about on the podcast, and it's ways in which you can make your school LGBT plus inclusive. So I'll pop the link for that in the chat bar. It's going to be releasing later this year, May and June, around Pride Month. But we think hopefully it's a really helpful resource for people as they try and make their classrooms and schools more LGBT plus inclusive. So if that's of interest, there's a link there, or perhaps if it's a bit pricey, you can ask your school to buy it for you. Is this okay to direct those students? Yeah, absolutely, Sarah. We did a couple of episodes on Heartstopper, the Netflix show, a while ago, and we had one of the actors in it called Fasay Akiade, who plays the teacher in it, and that was wildly popular with young people because obviously he's a bit of a hero. So yes, you're welcome to. Most of the episodes probably aren't for kids because they're kind of about teaching and teachers, but there might be a couple of episodes they find interesting. Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you for that question, Sarah. I think, yeah, I'm going to pass that one. We have a couple of events we run. There's Pride in Progress. We have a beginner teacher network. So if you are an LGBT trainee or ECT, you're very welcome to join that. It's kind of a termly event where we have speakers and topics of conversation and a chance to network. And we also have a book club, which is open to anybody. We have a range of texts. And the next book we're reading is The Transgender Issue, which I think is this Wednesday night. So possibly too short notice if you haven't read it yet. But we'll do another book soon and put those things out on our socials. Beth, how would you advise dealing with homophobic language from colleagues, especially when they are more established than you? Yeah, that's a great question, Beth. I didn't address it earlier for time, but we've got a minute now. So the IDEA acronym is still really helpful for that, but we're probably going to have a greater emphasis on the explain aspect. Now, I've had it before. Now, I get it as a trainee, you feel uncomfortable having that conversation, and that's when I'd let someone be your voice if you're not comfortable having it, as in me or your mentor or someone in school that you trust. But I think often when I've had to do it with colleagues before, it's more a calling in approach rather than a calling out approach, as in we're not doing it in front of others. We're having a conversation after the event, most likely in a closed door in an office, and you're explaining why that particular thing was either wrong or was upsetting to you or whatever it was. Now, in my experience, 99% of the time, when you explain why something was upsetting or inappropriate language, they do nothing but apologize and they vie to do better in the future, which is a brilliant thing. In the small instances where that's not the case, then there's escalation policies in the school where it's the head teacher or governors, if it's a senior leader, for example, or unions and so on. So those can be really uncomfortable conversations. I would encourage you to speak to someone that you trust so they can have it on your behalf or with you. But it is important to call out language we think is inappropriate in one of those ways. So hopefully that's helpful, Beth, but that's something I'm happy to discuss in more detail if it's helpful to do so. Okay, so we've had a whistle-stop tour there. We've discussed terminology, we've thought about the impact of the school building, and we've had a chance to do some scenarios and guidance. So thank you all for listening. And we've got a few minutes now, so please feel free in the chat bar to jump in if you've got any questions or anything you would like to ask. I think we've got a couple of bits coming through. Chris is asking a question on behalf of Veronica. In Spanish, we have the gender agreement. So I always say if you are male or identify yourself as male, etc. And I teach them the neutral gender with an E instead of an O for masculine and feminine. Brilliant, Veronica. Yeah, languages, of course, with masculine and feminine terms and words is very difficult, but that's a really nice way in which to phrase that. So thank you for that contribution. That's really helpful. Has anyone else got anything else they'd like to ask as a question? Pop it in the chat bar. Any comments or feedback? That's great. If after the event you've got things you'd like to ask or you've got more things you'd like to discuss in detail, the formatting is slightly weird, but I'm on Twitter at Dr. Adam Brett, or my email is adam.brett@ntu.ac.uk if you'd like to ask any questions later on. So that brings us to 4:45 almost. Like I say, if you've got a question, pop it in the chat bar and I'll stay on and answer those for a few minutes. But if not, I'll say thank you all very much for joining. Thank you so much for your contributions. It's been really valuable. I hope the session's been useful for you. And hopefully there's been some practical things you can implement in your practice going forward. So if you want to jump off, please do. Thanks so much for your time. I'll stay on for a minute just in case there's any questions or comments. But if not, have a great rest of the evening and I'll see you for the next session soon. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, V. Thanks, Izzy. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Emily. Brilliant. Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Sharon. You're welcome. Thanks, Andrew. Okay, right. I think I'm going to end the broadcast there. But like I say, the details are there on the screen. If you've got any further questions, have a great evening, everybody. Thanks so much for your time.